I'm not sure exactly which school of thought, Islamic creed based on Qur'an and Sunnah by Muhammad bin Jamil Zino is of, but it reminds me of a founding story of the Sunni divisions of Islam, how somebody had 50 beliefs and found 93 people to agree with him. People consider him as a successor to Ibn Abdul Wahhab, which has put him as if he was a hate preacher, and there's been some crediting him with some stuff in that regard, but I don't think that there's the evidence that we can blame Saudi Arabia on him or such behavior or whatever you're going to call it, right? Dar es Salaam has been gaining a reputation for editing out things in hadith books. So some people may say some issue regarding them, but what they do present of those books, it's accurate, and I don't think that there's a problem with the translation itself. There are some comments that I would say aren't supported, but that's with them. We're not talking about this book. So, seeking refuge with error, that we don't have error from ourselves, or we don't take in error, and that we turn to the authentic sources of Islam, that's very standard stuff. Saying that isn't hatred towards anybody. That the religion has 5 pillars: the testimony, the ritual prayer, the alms, the fasting, the pilgrimage. All schools of thought agree on that. The pillars of faith being the oneness and uniqueness of God, the belief in the infallibility of the light beings, God's scriptures, in their original form, the belief in the innocence of the prophets, both exemplar and messenger prophets, the belief in the judgment day, and the belief in God having the final say and God having foreknowledge and that sort of stuff is also universal among actual Muslimin. The purpose of life is to worship God. Worship is according to God's terms. We involve fear and hope. We try to perfect ourselves. We believe in the prophets as ones that refine our approach to the lawful and the forbidden. And we remember that God is the utmost in terms of names or worthwhile qualities. And that certainly we can provoke reactions of those present, but we don't do any act of worship for a place, for a thing, for some creation, for some idea. It's only towards God. And we believe with the real, definitions. We're not trying to put things into the forms of creation when we talk about God. We're not to neglect or negate names, certainly the positive and negative attributes, form a balance and don't have the sorts of limits that we would turn to if we, if we were disbelievers. We turn as believers to what is unlimited. We believe in a God that transcends the universe, and we talk about the throne and the footstool. The throne is greater than the footstool, and the footstool is greater than, the seven heavens, as we have it in the lesser. So God is beyond that. So, but that doesn't. Well, there's other verses we can apply to that. Because people say God is omnipresent. Well, by saying that, we're not saying that creation is God. And there's also plenty of sayings that indicate a person can't escape God. So if you can't leave God's presence, then, you can leave the awareness of that. Because certainly we've seen that God is with us. And not that false definition of Emmanuel that Christians will tell you, because that's not what Emmanuel means. Knew all, anything that ends in that all or yah, it's not God. But that's referring to a different tradition. But the only reason why we refer to different traditions is to point out that there is evidence outside of our faith towards these things. And when we say that also, we're saying that our faith is the faith of the previous messengers. Different language, different book, a different messenger. As far as what God's sending down, we're not, And as long as we're worshiping God and not amulets and not different things, there's a security in that. And good deeds are accepted according to their, the belief behind them and the intention behind them and the context, what that is for you, its efforts, that sort of thing. Bid'ah would be to consider something lawful that is forbidden, and the forbidden to be lawful. And the lawful to be forbidden, that sort of thing. So what God says through his prophet, either by revelation or inspiration, is to be accepted as is. Now, there is indication, not only people accepting Islam, but otherwise, that people can look and say, well, I'm going to step away from disbelief and other such things. Now, one of the things that people have for shirk nowadays is they say, forever really, is that people say that this happened because of such and such astronomical alignment. And sure, the tides have an effect with the moon. There's some light and some other minor things, but that's not the sort of thing that people are talking about when they look at astrology charts. And it's very, very important to die only as one who worships God. And Allah is, of course, the singular and definitive term of God. Now, the people who greet the graveyards, that's totally different than, because the prophet said stuff, oh, have you found this true, and that sort of stuff. But the people who take the dead as intercessors, or call them up and all that sort of stuff, the necromancy, and that type of necromancy, the word's broader than that, but I'm not going to get into that too much there. So certainly you don't supplicate them, and you don't make pilgrimages to graves, you don't circumambulate graves and all that other stuff. But the dead aren't able to do things for us in this world. And why would dead people have powers that, they don't have in life? It's God that helps. Anything that helps or benefits us is a means for God doing. Our own actions are a means for God giving us opportunity. And when we seek help from the living, certainly we pray for things and we act towards things. But the greatest help is seeking help with one another in terms of piety. And in terms of oaths, well, there's some oaths in the Qur'an, but what we're commanded towards is to make our vows about God. But we be careful with our oaths. We don't just go around by God, by God, by God, right? And then obviously it wouldn't be allowed to use now magic in English, particularly with the K, is not the same as sorcery. It's not the same as involving the jinn, but the seher, using the Arabic word, like people will literally, it is a form of worshiping things. They'll worship the charm or the amulets or the arrangement or whatever, rather than praying to God. Now, people using, having nice lighting and all that stuff, that's not the same thing. But the seher, from the ancient Egyptian, seher and sahar, is that would be the internal and the external evil magic, because the har is the trickery, or it's the playing with the jinn, that sort of stuff. Whether or not one is knowingly calling on these entities, because as I said, some people, make the invocation assault, and or they do it less directly like that. Well, the knowledge of the unseen, for example, it's not by looking at star patterns. People can look at reactions at people and say stuff about that. But the knowledge of the unseen, the spiritual realms and the future and all that stuff, doesn't come from looking at patterns or casting dice or shuffling cards or anything that I've ever said about that. You should know that I'm not saying that you shuffle the deck of cards and people's inner secrets and spiritual predictions and all that stuff. That's, not what I'm doing at all. In talking about that, I talk about anything. And non-Islamic laws, that's a form of disbelief. What you believe and what you do should be based primarily on the Qur'an, and really everything good and true is said to be encouraged in there, and everything evil and ignorant can be said to be discouraged in there. Certainly, you're sometimes under the authority of others. Now, doubtful thoughts don't amount to disbelief, but we can seek refuge in various ways. The Quran has different ways that are referred to that. Certainly the way that, people before reciting the Quran may say it in one way. People in their prayers may say it another way. People in their regular life may say it another way. But then again, we can look beyond the specific circumstances and really use any of those A'udhu Billah statements. Well, not any of those, but you know what I mean. There's a handful of them that are very specific towards those two purposes. And people had all sorts of beliefs, and some people act like they're monotheistic. It's like monotheistic stuff isn't going to bring you closer to God. And any ability to hurt or harm, again, that is with God's permission. And sometimes things happen because we evoke of ourselves. It's not that any other entity that's created gets involved in that. And sometimes we're going to get things, and as I said, God makes the final decision, so therefore our affairs, we should ask for God. Certainly, we involve the social structure and stuff that we're a part of. Seek out, you farm or whatever you do for work or to develop resources. And any knowledge of anything comes through God. You know what I mean? God has sanctioned any knowledge that any creation has. And worshiping other than God is said to have been something that outweighs the good deeds in life. And you shouldn't consider any to have partnership in divinity if, you're going to have hopes towards the afterlife. And a lot of people, they'll perform their shirk or shirking from monotheism because they see gaps in religion. Just like Christianity started worshiping saints and angels and stuff because there were things left out in how they talked about Jesus. But did Jesus, even in the Bible, tell people that he was a god and to worship him? No, he didn't. In fact, somebody literally thought he was the son of God, according to one story, and he, condemned it and performed an exorcism. Another person called him a good Lord, and he says, no good Lord, only the one God. And we should turn to God trying to figure out the means of approach. And that will help us as we go over the sources that have been left behind. And unlike government and all that stuff, God doesn't need intermediaries to accomplish these things. Now, you can ask for forgiveness of people, but remember, we do that for those thought to be Muslim. And when people are dead, that's it. But when they're living, actually, probably the better thing to do is to ask that people be guided, that they actually repent. And everyone can pray for their influence. Pray for the favor of what they have put out there. And so we don't even do things hoping for the intercession of the prophet. And the other innocent are infallible. Now, by infallible, as I said, the light beings, that's agreed upon. There's talk in the Qur'an about the people of the house that have, and the prophet gave the example. Hassan, Hussein, Ali, and Fatima were those examples. And the Quran talks about, for example, in Surah, in another chapter, that, there are those who will suspend their belief and suspend their action, until it's in agreement with what God has sent. Now, if you have taken part in a good cause, just like your influence, you get credit towards it. But when it comes to the prophets, let us remember that they are, very human individuals. And we can look also, so we believe that there was an initial human being, saying that, didn't come from other natural sources, whatever, but, it wasn't, and a lot of that talk too, it turns out that a lot of these so-called early humans weren't humans at all. They find a pig tooth and call it Nebraska Man, Lucy and Lucy's brother. Well, there's older humans that have been found than that, but we remember that there, in a way, was a civilized person, not necessarily civilized in what we consider now, but, humans from the start have been of a certain sort, and God called the light beings, and, the jinn were with them, but the light beings outnumbered that, and they were all called to acknowledge that human being. Now, the jihad isn't really the same thing as another pillar of Islam, but it's inherent, right? Because if you're struggling or striving, even when it's not the easiest thing to do, that's just how it is. And I would not have used Surah 9:41. I would have used some other verses to illustrate the point. But you could say that the first passage to be revealed, that shows you some important limits that you should look at. It's to defend everybody's place of worship, everybody's religious community. And then, the self-defense and that sort of thing mentioned in the first passage that you come across in the Qur'an in that regard. And there's the central bit, that, your love of God, your love of the messenger, and your love of the striving in his way is more important than the 5 circles of relationship and the 3 types of worldly means. And the best support in this world is the support of the fellow believers. And you shouldn't prefer even the friendship of the people who aren't Muslim, but that doesn't mean that, we're not friendly or that sort of thing. It's just generally there's a misunderstanding in that respect. And you can have a status. So the prophets talk about a status, and some of this you can attain to, like I've talked elsewhere about the stations of love. So you got the servant master, you got the friend, you got the parent child, you got the spousal, and you got the socially inappropriate. Of course, really you can't have the what are called the higher stages without actually doing the lower stages for God and sort of having that type of relationship with God. But that's, there's limited ways of speaking, so I understand why that specific Indian form is not explicitly mentioned prophetically, but the general spirit of that is there. And as I said, so the 2 sources of law is what's revealed and what's inspired, and people also talk about there's, Quranic things about consensus, because we talk about the way of the believer, we talk about the and so your analogy, reason, whatever, upon those sources, even going along, that is and so the scriptures are, the Al-Quran is the one of the international age. They're revealed so that people may follow what has been sent down, and to not do what's contrary to it, and to have that spiritual remembrance in life, and to make its opinions the utmost. And some differences may occur, but we should all turn to the primary 2 sources, first of all. The Quran and the Sunnah, or Hadith, or whatever you want to call it. But let's remember, when people say Sunnah or Hadith, whose Sunnah, whose Hadith, right? And just like it talks about biblically, love of God and obedience to God is contingent on obedience of the messenger. There's no psychopathic, well, I feel like this is the right thing, and there's more to it than that. And we're not fatalists. We're supposed to act. We're supposed to work on our beliefs. We're supposed to perfect them. And we can be honest. Our likes and dislikes aren't always going to be the same thing as pointing towards good and truth. Various philosophies have spoken, certainly Epicureanism and hedonism in general forms a generally good template of regarding the cost and rewards. But, it goes beyond that. Certainly we're not, we'd even agree with the biblical way of, well, not as far as to ban philosophy, but to say, we're not going to be one of these people who just instead we're following the quotes of philosophers. Same things with the musicians and all that other stuff. And the religion is perfected. So some people may talk about things in different languages or different terms, but, we're not adding, there's the obligations, what is allowed and forbidden. That base is still straight up there. And some of these things that are outside of the religion are such that, a person wouldn't be Muslim. Sometimes it makes a person a sinner. Sometimes it takes, sometimes it's more or less neutral. It's just, it'd be better if they didn't, or it'd be even better if they didn't. There's different ways of thinking about that. And anybody who does something new, again, it has to be part of the religion or it's rejected. That doesn't mean we're forcing things on people. So we're not saying that. And we're commanded to, work towards the cause of Islam. So any of our abilities that we enhance or develop or learn, that is something that is essential, to carry on here. And so just being strong or wealthy or pretty or whatever isn't the thing in itself. Of course, you could say that we guide. Sometimes things are, if you don't know a prayer, you just ask God, the oneness and all that. You remember God. You read the Qur'an. You might find the answer. So there, as I said, there is guidance. And we can relate that to how things were for certain prophets. But there's also care to be taken in that regard. You know what I mean? That, because people say, by the authority of such and such, as they, you got to be careful with that sort of stuff so that you don't pray through them. So let's pray for the hardship to be lifted according to what God has revealed and God has inspired to the prophet of the international age, so that we as individuals and as a group can become victorious. So from this book, I would definitely conclude that the claims that, it's a hate movement and it's breeding extremism, no, it's radical. It's radical, and that's their problem. Because what is radical is, willing to be different, are willing to be how it is, whether or not society is upon that mode. But certainly we are inviting society towards what is good, towards what is true, and away from evil and ignorance. Or at least we are doing our best in that regard. All flaws in our action, our presentation, well, that's from us, and we ask forgiveness for it. And may those who listen find out the truth for themselves.